What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 89, and I am the host, Kyle Lanslone. I'm joined by the co-host today, Will Porter. Will, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How you doing?
Pretty good. And I think we got a great show lined up for everybody today. We're talking about Pentagon spending, which never seems, I think, to me and you like the most important topic. We're usually breaking down like what's going on the ground in Afghanistan, what the U.S. policy is, what Biden's planning to do. But I think for a lot of people, the spending really is what hits home the most because you think about, oh boy, $700 billion. Just a small, tiny amount of that would be huge for anybody, right? Like, we're scraping here. Some people are lucky to get enough to get a $1,400 check here from the government. Small portion of the Pentagon budget for a lot of people will be absolutely great. So, talking about all the money that's being absolutely wasted in the Pentagon today, and Biden's lack of wanting to do absolutely anything about it. So, I think a great show lined up today. Maybe a great one to share. Again, this is, I think, more of a mainstream interest, the Pentagon spending budget. So, be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. That's where you get with the show notes, and you share it from there. You also find the video versions at YouTube and Odyssey. Subscribe to the show to there. And audio versions are out anywhere people could listen to podcasts. You also find the show on any of our social medias, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. Twitter's at con_interest. The last way you can support the show is by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you should go to get your CBD products. They have great lab-tested products there. My favorite is their topicals, which you could just rub on your skin and, relieve some local pain, where it's great for my back. Will, what's your favorite product over at Paloma Verde?
Yeah, I really like their melatonin soft gels. Those are the best for me. I have issues winding down and relaxing at night. Those are great. Also, just their high dose tincture, just like the oil extract, is great. It's packs the heaviest punch. I recently had a sore back that helped a lot. That's not the topical stuff. It's just stuff you swallow. But even that can help with your sore muscles. But if people are interested in that, you can go to PalomaVerdeStore.com. They have all kinds of like educational resources. They have their lab results that you can see. That's all, if you want to learn more about CBD, and use the promo code PEACE to get 25% off your order. So yeah, check that out.
All right, well, let's get into the show.
All right.
Today is the Pentagon budget and looking at the budget under Biden. Well, just off the top, I mean, Biden's talked about spending trillions and trillions of dollars. I mean, the progressive agenda, the ticket for that is massive, talking about healthcare for all, universal education, housing all the homeless. And look, I mean, in some ways, these are all, admirable goals, to want to put, homes and make sure people have healthcare and all this other stuff. At the same time, I just, don't want the government to control it because when they do, they kind of turn things into a train wreck. But one way maybe that Biden could try to get some of this done is at least looking at the Pentagon budget, especially with COVID and spending what they just passed a relief bill that was like $2 trillion, and that was on top of trillions and trillions of COVID relief last year. And look, right, we know they're not done with this. They're going to bail out some other sector in the name of COVID relief before we're done with this. And again, not that, there's enough in the defense budget to fund all of that, but if you're spending a lot of money, maybe you should be spending a little bit less. And so this is a place where maybe you could look for cuts. And it turns out that that's not what the Biden administration is going to do. We had this article by Mark Perry at Responsible Statecraft titled "Joe Biden Waves the White Flag on the Pentagon Budget." And this means that he's saying that the White House will flatline military expenditures, postponing a reset of defense spending priorities. And in some ways, this is a follow-up from a previous Mark Perry article where he talked about how some people in the Pentagon were really expecting, because of COVID, to have to look at some budget cuts. And, we weren't talking about going to like I don't know, having a military budget that's comparable to the second largest country, or second largest military budget being China at what, like 250 billion. They were talking about going down to like, 500 billion or something like that. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen. They're keeping the defense budget at around $700 billion. Well, what were some of your key takeaways from this article?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Mark Perry had said that he had spoken with a senior Pentagon official and said that when he had spoken with him previously, this official originally assumed sort of like the talk of the town would be that there would be cuts, that there even maybe possibly major cuts to the military budget. But this official said that Biden sort of made a decision that like he does not want to make waves, he does not want to pick a fight over the military budget for the sake of his own domestic agenda, and that's apparently what he wants to focus on. And so, yeah, like you said, he's going to sort of flatline, or at least call to flatline military expenditures, meaning just like no real change, no large increase or decrease. And he said Perry they're apparently supposed to put out a budget proposal for military spending in May. And yeah, Perry is saying that it's just shy of 700 billion for like the base budget. And then I think he said like once all is said and done, once you consider like the Department of Energy and the nuclear arsenal, I think he said it'd be more than 735 billion. Um, and if those figures are accurate, that would keep spending right about where they were under Trump. And he increased spending every year that he was in office. I think he brought the budget up by like $100 billion during his time there. And Biden is apparently content to retain those increases and to sort of he's not going to budge from that. And just to kind of keep that in perspective, that $700 billion number, that would keep our budget still bigger than the next 10 largest militaries on planet Earth combined. So, like you said, China, Russia, all the next largest militaries, we're still eclipsing the next 10 of them. It does not seem Biden's really, trying to get away from that trend. Now, there's something that's interesting that I was reading the other day. Trump did something kind of weird in his lame duck period before he left office, and he went ahead and they put forward a 2022 budget proposal. And I think that had something to do with Trump was disputing the election results. Usually in the lame duck period, they don't put forward that kind of proposal, but Trump was kind of claiming he won and kind of trying to govern as if he was still going to be president. So they did put out this 2022 budget proposal. And apparently they were going to try to almost zero out the Overseas Contingency Operations budget, which is supposed to be like the war fighting budget, like what they use for our overseas operations. And they were saying the Trump administration was saying they were going to do this that would be in line with the Afghan troop withdrawal and just sort of winding down the wars in general. However, it does not seem so clear to me that Biden would seek to do that. I don't expect that he will try to make a significant cut to the OCO budget. I don't get the idea that he's really rushing toward a troop withdrawal in Afghanistan, nor is he eager to wind down many of the other wars. So, in contrast to Trump, who knows if he ever intended to actually do that? Trump never got to implement that. He didn't win the election. But nonetheless, that is sort of a contrast here. I don't think Biden will try to zero out that budget. And the OCO itself, too, is kind of interesting. It's sort of a microcosm of like the broader military defense budget and sort of a lot of government spending and programs. Because originally the OCO was meant to be a one-time emergency expenditure after the 9/11 attacks for how to respond to that. And they've expanded it every year since. And now Congress has approved like $2 trillion over its lifetime. This thing that was originally supposed to just be a temporary program. And now we have it every single year since. But anyway, bottom line, does not appear Biden is going to be trying to, tamper with the military budget at all. And I think we had some examples to run down of just how they spend this money and maybe how it gets so high. So I'll kick it back to you.
Right. There's a one thing I want to note in the Perry article is one official said about the lack of concern that they had for potential budget cuts. And they said, this is all politics. Biden doesn't want to endanger his domestic agenda, which means he's got to pick a fight over defense, which means he's not going to pick a fight over defense dollars. And so, this is one of those things. People think that good government means that government officials aren't wasting our tax dollars. And here you pretty much have the Biden administration conceding that they're going to spend money on programs that they don't really believe in because picking a fight over, saving us money, let's say on the F-35 or something like that, they see as a political issue here. In this Mark Perry article, he highlights some of the people involved in the decision to keep the Pentagon budget. He says it was Biden, Harris, Ron Klein, Susan Rice, And then Brian Deese, and of course Susan Rice will be a pretty familiar name with listeners of this show. I had warned that even though she was in like a domestic and supposedly civilian role, she is going to get to make decisions when it comes to foreign policy. And here, she wants to keep us spending our money. Another thing was the White House is prepared to argue that even a modest defense budget cut could hurt the post pandemic economic recovery. And so this is the Biden administration buying into the same crap that the Trump administration did, that somehow, buying and making weapons is going to help the economy recover. Well, there's a bunch of homeless people right now, people who are really struggling to survive and get access to, the kind of things that we see as just basic and that we fortunately have in our lives, and yet they're saying that we need to build more weapons that's somehow going to help people. That it really doesn't make sense. They don't explain the logic there. And then another interesting part is that they said that the doing this was in exchange for having more political capital on immigration, infrastructure, and climate change. And so, they get Republican buying and they say, hey, Republicans, we're not going to touch your defense budget, but we are going to need a few votes here on immigration, again, infrastructure, and climate change. And particularly immigration and climate change, I mean, this seems extremely counterproductive, right? Like a cause for a lot of the immigration, a lot of the poverty, and a lot of the instability in Central Latin America is because of the U.S. foreign policy. And so if you really want to look at reforming that, you actually probably need to cut the Pentagon budget, especially the budget of Southern Command. And here, they're going to keep it the same. Again, with climate change, look, if you're concerned about carbon emissions, like, don't come at me and my Honda that I drive around in. Look at the F-35s that are flying around. I mean, they're constantly flying training missions. I live in Colorado now. Once or twice a week, I see one of those things flying overhead on a training mission. They're constantly flying all over in the South China Sea and flying B-52s to the Middle East and back. Why don't we talk about cutting that from the Pentagon budget, saving ourselves some money, and then you can also cut carbon emissions.
Yeah.
But this is just the extremely twisted logic of government and why it constantly fails and why they don't even get anything done, even if they claim to have good intentions. They're willing to trade away anything just to get some legislation passed that is going to probably be rather meaningless. Will, I guess that I think is all I had on the Perry article. Did you have anything else?
No, that was about it. I thought the main takeaway there is just that Biden doesn't seem, as with so many other areas we've pointed out, Biden seems like he's just continuing he's just coasting where Trump left off. He doesn't really have much of like a, any kind of agenda, or I don't know, any agenda he does have, I guess he's going to want to focus on the domestic. But yeah, in terms of military and foreign policy stuff, he's largely just, it's just the second term of the Trump administration.
There's a pretty good article at Anti-War Today by Dub Bandow, and he says that Biden's foreign policy is turning out to be Trump light. And I think
Yeah.
that's a pretty accurate statement so far. There's an article by William Hartung in Forbes, and it's titled "There's Plenty of Room to Reduce the Pentagon Budget." And he's saying that, look, we could cut $80 billion out of this budget real easy and not, force to have any major overhauls or anything like that. As part of this 80 billion, 11.4 billion would be through canceling future purchases of the F-35, and in a minute we'll get into a story of why that's even now more than ever a particularly good idea. Eliminating the Space Force as its own separate branch, so I guess that would, just put it back as the Air Force as it was before Trump, and that would say between 500 million and 2.5 billion. Reducing the contractor force by 15%, which is something that's been recommended by even the Pentagon's own internal commissions, could save $28.5 billion a year. Then they could eliminate the new ground-based nuclear deterrent. I could talk about that in a little bit more about why we could eliminate that program, no problem, and that would save 2.4 billion. And then, as you already talked about, the problems with the Overseas Contingency Operations fund, and we could cut that saving 20 billion for a grand total of 80 billion dollars in saving. Well, they say they could do that real quick and easy without actually changing really any of the massive wars the U.S. already wages. And again, $80 billion, we just passed a $1.9 trillion bill. I get that that's not going to make up that spending and anything, but again, that's our money that's just being wasted and given to weapons makers that we could save. What do you think about those cuts, Will?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a massive black hole of spending that you could cut these billions and billions of dollars and still really not even do much that would affect, like, and you wouldn't make any cuts that would even force us to change our policy or our posture around the world. Now, obviously, you and I want us to do that. We also, it's not just about the money here. These policies are destructive, but certainly they are also bankrupting our society. And so, yeah, I'm all for those kind of cuts. I wish they would go further and, go beyond that and actually, scale back the empire and the overall scope of our policies and stuff. But nonetheless, yeah, I would love to see just like this like dead weight being cut first, at
Right.
least.
I think one of the reasons people, it's just so tangible. Like, how many people could imagine having just like 0.001% of that $80 billion, right? Like,
Yeah.
it would be life changing for almost everybody I know.
Yeah.
And probably everybody there, there's a few people not, but it just again, a small fraction of this money to the American people would be huge, and yet we you again are going to drop it on worthless projects like the F-35. Here we have an article. Oh, it actually isn't displayed. Anyways, it's from the Drive, and it is basically the F-35 shot itself. It fired a round from its 25 millimeter underbelly cannon, and the pod exploded under the plane, causing $2.5 million in damage. Will that absolutely crazy that we have this plane that they've been working on for how many decades now. It's going to cost us the total program over $1 trillion, and all these years later it's still not capable. It's still flying and shooting it. I mean, you can't having this in a natural combat situation. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, there have been all kinds of crazy problems like this. Man, I wish I could recall the numbers off the top of my head. There was like a study or a review done by the military, like in the last year or so, where they found X number of like malfunctions and problems with the F-35, but it was like 800 like software glitches. Like even its like software systems are screwed up. There have been all kinds of issues with it being able to like fly through sand, fly through rain. Like the stealth coding has had all these issues. This thing has just been a massive boondoggle. It's one of the most expensive pieces of hardware we've developed, and it's supposed to kind of be this like multi-purpose, can do everything fighting plane, and it ends up not being able to do really anything. So it's just this is like an emblematic case of just military waste and boondoggles. And there've been multiple like high level military people who've come out and said that like we should try to develop some kind of replacement for the F-16, which is a much more reliable and useful plane. But no, they're insisting on trying to do this Lockheed boondoggle, this plane that's supposed to be able to accomplish everything, and they're pouring billions and billions of dollars into it, and it doesn't seem to be very successful.
So I did have an article on the ground-based strategic deterrent, but there's been a lot of good writing on this lately because they're planning on building a new missile that's going to cost billions of dollars. That project that's going to, be the kind of missile that's deployed in the nuclear sponge, which basically we spread a bunch of missiles out in what they, consider low-populated areas, and I think Wyoming, the Dakotas, maybe Nebraska, Colorado, and Missouri. I think there's 5 states in total, so I maybe have one too many on that list. But they deploy all these little nuclear silos there. All the infrastructure for them is deteriorating. I hear like the facilities like have leaked over the years and stuff like that. So you have these two people stuck underground for hours at a time, and like moldy and just kind of bad places. And so that's gonna be a lot of money to shape up But on top of that, again, you had these nuclear missiles, and they're part of the nuclear sponge, which means that if, let's say, the U.S. were to go to nuclear war with Russia, Russia would have to spend a significant amount of its nuclear arsenal targeting the U.S. ground based missiles because the U.S. could, if they don't take those out, the U.S. could retaliate with those missiles. One of the problems with that is that the ground based missiles, unlike the bombers or the submarines, are stationary. So you kind of gotta use it or lose it kind of thing. If you think the Russians have launched their missiles at your ground based missiles, you either have to fire them right then or know that they maybe go to waste. They all get destroyed and nothing happens with them. And so there's a lot of very smart people on this who say, look, you have the nuclear triad, and every smart person who's ever read whatever Marco Rubio has read knows that you have to maintain the nuclear triad no matter what. But in reality, why do you need the ground based if you have the bombers and the submarines? And I think the real key in all of it is the submarines. They're so hard to find. They're loaded up with the Trident missiles, so I think each of them has like 160 warheads on it. So just one submarine is a sufficient nuclear deterrent. Assuming that you believe that the U.S. has to be able to, fire enough nuclear cruise missiles at Russian cities to make sure that crazy Vladimir Putin wouldn't try to nuke and eliminate like Washington, D.C. and the entire U.S. military or something like that. So we could negotiate away these ground-based missiles with Russia. That way, we don't have to waste our money on them. But in the idea of the foreign policy thinker's mind, we have to develop these new missiles. That way we can negotiate them away one day in the future or have them as a deterrent for Russia. So that's a real problem. Well, let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, I have this article on just more things that the U.S. is wasting money on. It's from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, titled U.S. Failed to Collect from Partners in Afghanistan for Use of Military Aircraft. Dave writes, from September 2017 to September 2020, the Pentagon failed to charge coalition partners in Afghanistan for the use of rotary wing aircraft. According to a new report from the Defense Department Inspector General, over 3 years, the U.S. spent $773 million to transport U.S. and other coalition forces around Afghanistan. Since the U.S. failed to keep track of the fights, the U.S. has no way of knowing how much coalition partners owe of the $773 million. So, this is like a taxi cab service that's been driving around without functioning meters, and nobody thought to say anything for 3 years. Will, it's absolutely incredible. And again, think about just what a small fraction of that money would do for you that they completely wasted there. Anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, just like Afghanistan is outrageous. If you look at some of these reports from the guy's called Sigar, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, Joe Sopko, he's put out just like report after report after report over the years, just finding insane levels of waste and like it's almost hard to believe. It almost like has to be deliberate corruption, and in some cases it is on the local forces on the ground, like gaming this whole system. But I don't know. I'm even suspicious of some of the U.S. forces of just how this money gets thrown around. They recently, Joe Sopko recently just put out a report finding that we wasted $2.4 billion on just buildings in Afghanistan. Buildings that either were like, just got destroyed and they weren't maintained, or buildings that were impossible to maintain. That like you built this crazy modern structure that can't really, be maintained as it is in the location it is in Afghanistan. And so they just ended up pouring billions and billions into these buildings that are just like decrepit and or abandoned or not used. It's incredible. And previous reports have found that they wasted millions on buying the wrong kind of camouflage. They bought like forest green camo, even though Afghanistan has very few like forests. Like it's that's not really useful. You need like brown camouflage there. Just endless things like this were just millions and millions of dollars. And a point you keep making is just like how many year-long salaries for each of us does that represent? Each one of these stupid boondoggles. How many thousands of Americans did you just throw away a year of their work for, basically? Like the equivalent amount of money. It's just insane. Afghanistan is one of the worst boondoggles and just black holes for money.
Right. So another big waste of money we have coming up here is shoot, another article that didn't load up right. Anyways, the U.S. is planning to spend, and I'll link to this article in the show notes page for people who want to look at it. $7.6 billion, but up to 10 to 12 billion on the new generation of missile interceptors. The contract is going to Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. One will get, I think, 2.2 billion, so $200 million more than the other. And then, of course, we need this because of the ground-based missiles, right? Russia has ground-based missiles, so we think that we need to be able to shoot down the Russian ground-based missiles because we have, our own. And again, this seems like something that we could probably eliminate if we could eliminate ground-based missiles, but we're going to, get sucked into that. And again, this is the initial what the Pentagon is saying. Who knows how much we're going to pay for it? It's not like the Pentagon initially said that the F-35 was going to cost $1.5 trillion. These things always cost more and more and more. Well, let's see. I have another article here from Dave DeCamp, and it's titled "U.S. Spend $34 billion to house U.S. troops in South Korea and Japan from 2016 to 2019." This money is included within the military budget, but it's just crazy how much money that is, especially when you break down the numbers. For Japan, the U.S. has 55,000 troops stationed there. Over those 3 years, it cost $20.9 billion. But Japan only paid us $12 billion to have those troops there. In Korea, we have 28,500 troops. We've paid $13.4 billion, and South Korea has paid $5.6 billion. And so this is just huge amounts of taxpayer money. And well, if you had to come out of your pocket every year to pay for those troops to be in Japan and South Korea. Like maybe when you went to get your ballot, you had to check all the things you want to pay for or something like. Do you really want to pay that much money to have troops in South Korea or Japan?
Don't think I do.
Right? Do Americans think that's a relevant security concern, or what are those forces supposed to do anyways? North Korea has nuclear weapons. We'll nuke North Korea if it comes. You know what I mean? If they nuke somebody else, that's what we'll do. South Korea has a massive conventional army. What are the 55,000 troops in Japan going to do? Stop the rise of the emperor again? Is that the concern, or is it China? Are those 55,000 troops going to stop a Chinese invasion, or is it again nuclear warfare because we all have nukes? Like, what's the point of these massive conventional forces other than basically to be potential targets for the North Koreans? You know what I mean?
That's right.
Maybe if they don't have the missile technology to actually hit an American city from North Korea, Okinawa, Guam, hell of a lot closer.
Yeah, it's almost like they're there for that reason, to be a tripwire or something, to sort of be there's always the risk that if you attack this country, you might then kill American troops and bring them into the situation. But I mean, yeah, like these both South Korea and Japan are rich capitalist countries with their own, fairly decent militaries. They don't need these couple like you're saying, these are pitiful amounts of troops anyway that couldn't really make any difference in the event of any real invasion. And yeah, it's just they're just there to be tripwires, it seems, and yeah, we're paying billions of dollars to keep them there.
This one of the last articles I have here on spending is, well, if we haven't talked about enough absurdity on today's show, in the amount of money the Biden administration has and is spending on the military, now Biden wants an infrastructure project to rival China's Belt and Road. And so China, a country with 4 times the population of the U.S. and a military budget that's like a quarter of the U.S., apparently has been spending some of their other money, I guess, building infrastructure in other countries or like financing port projects and stuff like that. The U.S. doesn't like that because I'm sure it undercuts the IMF, and then they get to pretend that they have control over other countries and, influence like what country has what flag over Taiwan at their airport and stuff like that, right? And also swindle these countries out of their natural resources when they can't afford the loan payments. And I just read recently with Ukraine, in fact, that Ukraine is trying to pass specific anti-corruption laws, in part because of the demands from Western countries to get more loans to pay back, the loans they already owe on. It's just like a trap to influence these. But anyways, Biden wants a massive spending project for that too. So again, they're trying to compete with China on all these fronts, and it's just impossible. And I see that, and I just see more of my tax dollars going right down the hole. The last thing I had on spending is to go to the Watson Brown University cost of war project and to just check out here. Well, since 9/11, the post 9/11 wars have cost $6.4 trillion, and that is just in the like physical dollars that we spent on the war. It doesn't actually figure in the opportunity cost of the over 800,000 people that have been killed in those wars, and all the damage done to the American youth by sending them to fight and die in these pointless wars, coming back with all kinds of trauma and physical ailments. Will, anything else on U.S. spending?
I mean, I would just say that like that we see how it gets to that point. How you get $6.4 trillion in spending. All this stuff adds up. You're talking about all this, ground-based deterrent, the secondary missile system you need to defend that. They're talking about building a missile chain on the or a missile network on the first island chain to combat China. They're doing all these military exercises, which themselves are fuel even to do those is costs, like I'm saying, full salaries of an average American. So yeah, we see how this stuff adds up. Just there's project after project, boondoggle after boondoggle, all this different black holes where this money goes into. Sooner or later, yeah, you get going on, sooner or later it will be 10 trillion.
Yeah. Probably not that many years away either.
Yeah.
So, Will, let's talk for a minute about Yemen. We just passed the 6th anniversary of this war. We knew each other and were talking back in 2015 when this thing started, and it sounded unbelievable. And if Will, I told you at the time that you were going to be right, that 6 years later we are sitting on a pile of 250,000 bodies and no end in sight to the Saudi war, and the UN warning about 400 children starving to death this year, you'd be absolutely horrified that you were going to be right. But you were, unfortunately, and it all goes back to the start of this war in 2015. Rolling back, I guess, roll back a little bit further to do. I just want to do a brief recap on Yemen. Since 1990, Yemen has been ruled or was ruled by the dictator Saleh. He united the country that was once North and South Yemen. In 2010, 2011, Arab Spring comes to Yemen. He's pretty seriously injured in an assassination attempt and flees the country. Then the State Department with Hillary Clinton swoops in and sets up an election. The election was a fraud to give legitimacy to a government because there was only one person in an election. Kind of, takes away the whole point of having an election. I'm sure, all the dictators that we hate would have tons of elections if they were the only name on the ballot, and a lot of them do. Like Al-Sisi in Egypt. He holds elections and, imprisons anybody who runs against him. So it's pretty easy to win an election that way. But then this guy, Mansour Hadi, ends up being the leader of Yemen. He was the former vice president. And he overstays the mandate that was given to him in that fraudulent election. And then ends up really alienating a group in the north known as the Houthis. The Houthis then aligned with the, I guess, medically recovered former leader Salah and went and were able to take the capital city from the then kind of defunct Yemeni government led by Hadi. Yemen wasn't the United States of America, where when it's time for the president to hand over the keys to the army's going to go with the new president. It didn't matter what Trump was going to say on January 20th or January 21st. Biden was the guy who had the nuclear codes. That's the way it works in America. That's not the way it works in Yemen. And so they were able to wage through 2014 a pretty successful campaign against the pretty weak Yemeni government, again led by Hadi, and they were pretty close to taking the port city in southern Yemen, which was kind of the last stronghold of the government. For anybody who's watching, I have a map up here. The capital city is Sana'a, and then that port city is Aden. Eventually, the Saudis got involved, and that was on March 26, 2015, and waged a pretty serious bombing campaign that pushed the borders and boundaries of what's in Yemen to pretty close to what's on the map today. The war's been relatively stalemated throughout, while Saudi Arabia is able to wage a bombing campaign that prevents the Houthis from mounting any offensives that have threatened many major cities. Right now, there's one going on, but throughout the war, there haven't even been like major pushes to take new territory or something like that. Borderlines have been relatively stagnant. But while that has gone on through these 5 years, Saudi Arabia has waged a blockade of Yemen. And me and Will, in a recent article, broke down a CNN story where they detailed how even now there's 14 ships sitting off the coast of Yemen, and they can't go dock and port to give the fuel and other supplies that the Yemeni people desperately need. These are the supplies they need to keep these 400,000 children from starving to death, and the Saudis are preventing those ships from docking. So that has been going on the whole time, as well as a savage bombing campaign. I have an article here. Let's see, by Martha Mundi, and she is with Tufts University, and she concluded that with the Saudi targeting strategies and their pattern of aerial bombardment, that they're essentially waging a food war on Yemen. They've targeted cereal production facilities and the livestock and stuff like that, and taking out just a lot of the food production capabilities internally in Yemen, which was a country even prior to this conflict that imported a lot of its food. And so that's why the starvation situation is as bad as it is. Of course, when people are that low on food and that that weak, that they're severely malnourished, things like COVID, cholera, diphtheria run rampant, and there's thousands of Yemenis dying from that as well. A couple other horrific things that have come out of this war is let me get into the U.S. got into this war to placate Saudi Arabia. This wasn't the Trump administration that I know was constantly on his knees for Mohammed bin Salman, but this was the Obama administration. And they admit that this is written in the New York Times. This is a statement, like, this is from the administration. This isn't some scoop expose. 2 days of discussion in the West Wing followed, but there was little real debate. Among other reasons, the White House needed to placate the Saudis as the administration completed a nuclear deal with Iran, Saudi Arabia's archenemy. That fact alone escaped concerns among many of the president's advisors that Saudi-led offensive would be long, bloody, and indecisive. Well, is that not just the most damning statement ever, that you would start and support an offensive campaign against a sovereign state that, while it was in the middle of a civil war of its own, Saudi or the U.S. had absolutely no business in, and we're going to support that Saudi intervention in order to sign a peace deal with another country? How? I don't understand what the Constitution is. Of course, I got my Lysander Spooner over my shoulder here, so I obviously understand why the Constitution doesn't work, but just how they get away with this in America in 2016 was absolutely unbelievable. But they started and fueled the war there. Some other really terrible consequences of this war was, of course, that we end up being on the side of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They're the enemy of the Houthis, and they work well with the Saudis and the Emiratis, who the U.S. is allied with in this war. And so the AP found that U.S. allies, again, that's the UAE and Saudi Arabia, paid Al Qaeda in Yemen and allowed them to leave various Yemeni cities with wads of looted cash and weapons. And so, Will, if there's anybody in Yemen who's a threat to me or you in the United States and any other American who isn't wearing U.S. Army fatigues in the Middle East. If there's anybody who is a risk to the U.S. in Yemen, it's Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And yet, our allies in this war, as a part of the war effort that we're supporting, is allowing Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to walk out of cities with money and weapons. Why would we do that? It is unbelievable. Other things that have happened are this is again from the AP in Yemen, secret torture prisons. I believe the UAE tortures and the US interrogates, and basically the US is complicit and knows about the torture prisons that the UAE is running in Yemen, and we're like submitting them questions to ask the people being tortured. Horrible, horrible stuff going on here, and it's all because of the war we're involved in. Of course, all the targeting and killing of things like funerals and weddings and hospitals have been done with U.S. bombs. This is from CNN, exclusive report titled "Made in America: Shrapnel Found in Yemen Ties U.S. Bombs to String of Civilian Deaths Over Bloody Civil War," and they just go through and you'll see fragments of U.S. bomb after U.S. bomb, many made by Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, used to kill just innocent children, and kill in the most horrific ways. Some poor kid's leg gets blown off, and they lay there and die out under a pile of cement. That's their life. And then you had to also realize that one kid ends up surviving out of an entire household. His entire family gets blown apart. He probably sees the results of that, like his little sister scattered across the room in many pieces. What are we doing to this entire society by allowing Saudi Arabia to wage this war? And yet now 3 successive presidents have let it gone on. Not only are the weapons being used to slaughter civilians, they're also ending up in the wrong hands, including in the hands of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and our alleged enemies in this actual conflict, the Houthis. So, Will, I think I made a pretty strong case of why this war has been completely stupid. How the hell is it still going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I think you just did a great job sort of summarizing how we got here over the last 6 years and a lot of the insane sort of developments and outcomes of this conflict. I guess I would just stress just like the devastating effect on the civilian population that the bombing campaign has had. I mean, you kind of mentioned a few of these things, but the Saudis have bombed hospitals, clinics, schools, school buses full of children sometimes, farms and factories and grain silos and ports and bridges and homes and ancient cultural sites and funeral processions and wedding parties and pretty much every kind of civilian activity and structure that you can imagine. The Saudis and the UAE have dropped an American-made bomb on that. It's just, it's incredible. At one point in the war, it was reported in the New York Times that 60% of Yemen's hospitals had been destroyed or damaged in the bombing campaign. And that has, as I've explained in the show before, had a massive effect on how their ability to collect and count the casualties. Because a lot of that data comes from hospitals and clinics. And when they're just destroyed, like you have no real way to get this data out. I mean, like we've had some estimates that are out. They're fairly unreliable and conservative. I think the UN puts it just around 250,000 casualties. And I think they say about half of those have been from deprivation, from indirect causes. So like lack of food or medicine or, these various things. And the U.S. government owns every last bit of this. The war could not have happened without, U.S. support. We sell them the warplanes. We sell them the bombs. We train their pilots. We, for some time, provided the mid-air refueling to their warplanes. We give them logistics support. We help them with targeting. We repair their vehicles. Some of these things I think have since stopped, but for the majority of the war, we did those things. And then we also defend the Saudis before the United Nations. We allow them to basically investigate every allegation of war crimes and to clear themselves of those. So this entire thing, every single step along the way, could not happen without U.S. support. And the Biden administration is apparently going to be changing some of this. They say they will. But over the last 6 years, this has been a bipartisan policy. We've had a Republican and a Democrat in office overseeing this and continuing pretty much the same thing.
Right. So one of the other key things that the U.S. does is helps enforce the blockade of Yemen and all the Saudi rules that basically prevent, the actual cargo from making it to the ports. Never mind that they've bombed the ports and destroyed the cranes, so it's not very easy or efficient to get all the cargo off of the ships, but they could do it if some of the ships or A ships were able to get into port, and they have a ton of restrictions. And I've read stories about how a ship going to the port of Aden, so that's the supposed Saudi-backed government-controlled port, was told that it had to go all the way back to a port in Saudi Arabia twice before it was finally allowed to dock. These are the kinds of inspection things that happen, and the U.S. is enforcing that in more ways than one. This isn't something that is highlighted a lot, but in 2017, the Houthis had apparently developed some okay missile capabilities to shoot missiles at ships out in the, I guess, Gulf of Aden, or what would that be, the Red Sea there.
The Red Sea,
And
yeah,
the
yeah.
U.S. then targeted and actually hit Houthi sites in response to a missile landing like 6 nautical miles away from a U.S. ship. And so
Yeah.
that's another way that they help enforce the blockade. By the Houthis don't have navy at all. The Saudis bomb, just Yemeni fishermen's boats. I apparently have tried to lace up like a couple boats with explosives and use those, but they don't have a
Yeah.
real navy. They don't have a real air force. And so if you prevent them from being able to launch anti-ship missiles, then you're effectively permitting the blockade to happen in that sense too, by taking away any ability to inflict any suffering or pain on the Saudis for trying to carry out that blockade. Will, anything else on Yemen? Biden has made some statements that sounded somewhat positive on Yemen, but it doesn't seem like it's changed anything so far. Do you see any positive outlook in the future here?
I mean, I don't see much changing on the ground. I know the Saudis recently put forward some kind of like ceasefire proposal. They've done that before. Sometimes it's not totally clear that they're sincere about that because like the Houthis have made their, desires and demands clear for a long time. They're asking for the blockade to be lifted, like fully, to allow food and fuel and medicine and humanitarian aid to go into the country. And they've sort of drawn a hard line on that. And the Saudis refuse to meet it. They'll allow a couple ships to come in at a time, or they'll offer that. But the Houthis have sort of like, they've maintained that until you lift the blockade, we're going to keep fighting you. And indeed, they have. In the last week or so, we've actually over the last few months had quite a few of these Houthi strikes, like drone attacks and launching various kind of projectiles into Saudi Arabia. We recently had one at a Saudi oil terminal that I covered it, but I only was sort of on it for the preliminary breaking phase of the story, so I don't have too much extra to add. But nonetheless, there have been a wave of Houthi attacks recently on largely targeting economic targets, oil installations and stuff.
Right. Well, I think that's all I have on Yemen. I want to update a story we talked about last week, and that was North Korea, where up
Yeah.
until that point in the Biden administration, North Korea hadn't carried out any major weapon tests, and then we had two in a relatively short period of time, probably a week. North Korea fires two short-range missiles. I believe those were cruise missiles. Or do you know if that's a known detail, Will?
Yeah, I believe the first one they did a couple Sundays ago, those were two cruise missiles, yes.
Okay. And then they carried out a test of two ballistic missiles just a few days ago, towards
Yeah.
the end of last week. And, both of these tests weren't carried out at any specific target or anything. Does it seem like these are new technologies at all, or is there any details on that? Or is this maybe North Korea just trying to generate some headlines?
I think it's a little bit of both actually, because the North Koreans did come out a few days after the more recent launch, which as you said, was two ballistic missiles, and they claim that they used some kind of new missile system there. They didn't put out a lot of detail on what they were using, but they did claim that it had some kind of increased payload capacity. It could carry a heavier warhead, I guess. So they are claiming that there's some kind of new missile technology that they're testing. I think they called it a tactical ballistic missile. It's not a long range missile. I think it's short to medium. And yeah, that one last Thursday they fired, I think, into the Sea of Japan, or also called the East Sea in North Korea, whereas the previous one was over on the western side of the peninsula. But the North Koreans are claiming that they're testing some kind of new technology. Although, as you said, I think it's also intended to be sort of a, to get the attention of the Biden administration. They timed the second one, seemingly timed it right around the time for Joe Biden's first formal press conference. Maybe they were hoping he would be asked about that there or something. I don't actually recall if he was. I don't think they did ask him about the missile test at that one. And the North Koreans also claimed in a statement, they said that they denied that this was to get the Biden administration's attention. They just said, hey, we're just, doing our testing our technology and stuff. But that seems probably not true. It seems like they did try to coincide it for a time with Biden where he would be, asked about it. And, as we covered recently on the show, the North Koreans had said that they will deny any dialogue with the U.S. until the U.S. drops its sanctions and its hostile policies, its military drills and all this kind of stuff. And so perhaps this missile test was designed to try to, create a sense of urgency for the Biden administration a little more, to try to like produce some movement there. Now, Biden, of course, like did respond to this the missile test. He said something like the U.S. will respond accordingly if North Korea decides to escalate. I think he said so. It was kind of a veiled threat. The North Koreans responded to that and said that the U.S. is acting like a gangster, and they're saying that they're denying North Korea's right of self-defense that all sovereign states are supposed to have. And they do that. The U.S. is doing that even as the U.S. tests its own weapons and carries out all these provocative military drills. In fact, I think just like a week ago or so, we recently tested one of our Minuteman III ICBMs. Obviously not with a warhead on it. We didn't do an actual nuclear test, but we did test the delivery system and fired it into the Marshall Islands. I think they said it flew for like 4,000 miles. And so we're allowed to test all of our, world, society, civilization destroying weaponry as much as we want. But the North Koreans, if they test something vastly less powerful, we're going to try to lecture them. And which is especially rich because the North Koreans say they have this missile capability to deter an American invasion. That's their whole rationale for it. And so it is kind of rich that we would seek to lecture them about their missile tests.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the unbelievable things about the U.S. foreign policy was the hypocrisy and just getting used to like there's no way that they would tell the North Koreans that they can't test a missile and then announce that we're building our own brand new Minuteman missile, but that's what's happening.
Right.
Speaking of the press conference, there, me and you both suffered through that. It had its moments that were, I don't know, like in a depressing way, kind of entertaining. I didn't feel like I really got anything new out of the press conference. I feel like Biden answered every question how you kind of expected him to, although sometimes
Right.
he needed to pause, struggle, or ramble a little bit more. Although on Afghanistan, I guess, is where we had maybe the most interesting. Yeah, I get maybe he made claims about the border, but let's go to Afghanistan where he did come out with a couple of statements. So what were your takeaways on Afghanistan, Will?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with you. There wasn't a whole lot that was like groundbreaking or new here, but it was kind of interesting. We do now have it from the horse's mouth in the form of this press conference, where Biden is saying that we are not going to meet the May 1st troop withdrawal deadline set out in the deal with the Taliban that Trump signed last year. He didn't really explicitly say like, no, we're for sure not going to meet it, but he keeps saying, oh, it's going to be hard to meet it, and he's all but saying that it's not going to happen. We're not withdrawing by this deadline. He kept saying that like we won't be staying there a long time beyond that deadline, but he won't explain what that means. Like, what is that? We've been here there for 2 decades now, and what is he talking? A few more days, a few more months, a few more years? I don't even know if he knows. I don't know if he even has any like clear picture in mind of what's going to happen there. He said the most specific thing he said, I think, was that he can't imagine that we would be there still in 2022. So it's just, but I don't know. Is that just because of his lack of imagination, or is that because that really isn't going to happen?
He
It's really,
said it
it's hard to
like,
know.
oh, I couldn't imagine that. So like maybe he
Yeah.
literally can't imagine that because he doesn't have the brain power, or he's saying
Right.
like, no, there's no, why? Because you could take it kind of either way. Like he was either saying like, no way, or like, well, boy, I can't think about that. Like that's kind of hard to think about.
Yeah, it didn't sound very decisive or very definitive at all. It just was kind of like, well, I can't really picture it, but like I don't know. It just doesn't really seem like a very good way for a president to be thinking about this. Shouldn't he have some kind of like vision or plan or idea or something? Like just no, he just said, I can't really imagine us being there past next year. I don't know. That was just not very. It didn't inspire a lot of confidence.
No.
Another thing that to note that he didn't mention. He didn't mention anything about this peace plan, this supposed peace plan that they're pushing on Afghanistan now. He didn't even mention that at all. In fact, he framed the whole thing as like, it's a logistics problem. We can't get out by May 1st because, like, geez, it's just so hard to, put that many people in airplanes and fly them home or something. That's how he made it sound. But he didn't even mention that they're embarking on this whole new thing where they're going to like rewrite the Afghan constitution. They're going to try to arrange a ceasefire. They're going to try to set up new elections. They're going to try to set up an interim government. This massive tall order for themselves. And nope, that didn't get a single mention from Biden. He didn't even hint on that at all. He just said that, geez, it's going to be hard to load all those people onto airplanes, which is just a weak, lame excuse. If they had been committed to this withdrawal, then they would have been thinking about it from day one, and they would have had all that stuff lined up, to begin with.
Right.
So I don't know. There's not too much new here from what Biden said. Like, it didn't seem like they were going to abide by this May 1st withdrawal deadline, but now it really seems like we have it from the horse's mouth that that's not going to happen. However, another interesting thing in the last week that I saw that I think kind of helps to explain just some of the pressure that Biden is facing. Not to say that he's not responsible for his own decisions, but I think he is also under pressure from the military establishment for sure and the intelligence agencies to stay in Afghanistan, because we have these reports. If people are watching, they'll see on screen now that he's getting all these warnings from the intelligence community that if we leave Afghanistan, then the Taliban's going to take over within a couple of years after we leave, and they're going to host Al Qaeda there again. They're going to invite them right back in. And so they're trying to feed him all these like very scary sounding stories to convince him to stay. And it does kind of sound like it's working. And the last thing I'll say here is like some of this is predicated on what they call is the safe haven myth, the idea that the Taliban will allow Al Qaeda to have some kind of like safe base in Afghanistan. And as Scott Horton has pointed out so many times, this is a ridiculous idea. Like, there is no magical portal from the Helmand province into New York City. Like, it's a pretty remote area that if you're there, it's not very easy to get into the U.S. This whole idea is kind of based on the 9/11 attacks, that Al Qaeda was based in Afghanistan before those attacks. But the hijackers didn't plot the attacks from Afghanistan. They planned them from like Hamburg, Germany, and like Hollywood, Florida, other cities in the U.S. And so this whole thing is a ridiculous myth. That the Taliban's just going to invite in terrorists to stay in Afghanistan, but yet it's still being used to justify our presence there, and Biden is still being hit over the head with this outrageous myth.
Right. You make a point there that you're not trying to like make an excuse for Biden or anything like that. Got a couple of heated comments about how like somehow on the last episode when we said that the Pentagon strong arm Trump, people were like, "Oh, you're just making excuses for Trump," and that's not the point. The president can really make an effort to withdraw troops here. But we have to acknowledge that the reality of the situation too, which is if Trump, especially in the waning days of his presidency, when maybe there actually was a case there where he couldn't have withdrawn the troops. Pelosi was apparently talking about like, the military stuff with the president and everything anyways. So I'm not exactly sure if like on January 10th, if Trump had ordered every troop home from Afghanistan, if they would have come. I don't know. I think the generals would have strong-armed him on something like that. But he didn't have to like get to that point in the first place. He could have withdrawn troops in 2017. Right? Like, right. And it's his failure, absolutely. But at the same time, to talk about what the dynamics are and what's actually happening in D.C. and with the Pentagon is important because that's how the entire country operates, and understand what and how far the military will go to try to keep Afghanistan is very important point, and where I think we're seeing this here although this is apparently from the intelligence community rather than the Pentagon on this one. Will, anything else?
I think that was about it. Like you said, there was a couple other noteworthy moments of Biden's press conference, like completely losing his train of thought and just bailing on the sentence. Like he had a few of those that we've seen from Biden before. Not a great show of strength or competency from the president. But I think the Afghanistan stuff was the most interesting to comment on.
You almost gotta give the guy credit that he's willing to like, because I've seen him do it so many times, that he's willing to just bail on a sentence in the middle of it.
It's bold,
yeah. It's hard to do because you might be worried about what people assumed the rest of the sentence was gonna be, or that you would look like an idiot for doing it. But the guy is willing to do it time and time again. So. Credit to him for that. I also enjoyed, there was like one or two points where somebody asked him a question and You would tell it took him a second to process it. He was like, "Oh boy, what's the answer here?" So,
Yeah.
I don't
Jeez.
think it was the strongest showing. He got a little feisty at one point, and that was entertaining. But just bad news all around on the foreign policy front. It doesn't look like it's going to get any better. Well, it was great talking to you again. Will Porter is on Twitter at the Will Porter. Follow him there, and you will see all of his articles. He always posts everything he writes up there. I'm at Kyle Anslow underscore. I usually am good about sharing out my daily news roundup there, but check out the Libertarian Institute. That's also where you find the show with the full show notes page. Libertarianinstitute.org. Support the show. You can do that by donating. The links to the Bitcoin Cash wallets are in the show notes page. Patreon and Subscribestar are set up. Follow the show video version on YouTube and Odyssey, and then everywhere else you listen to podcasts. Will, anything else to plug?
That's it, man.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All right, thanks, Kyle. See you, everybody.